We are this morning, in Thursday Morning Torah, looking at Parshat Korach. And Korach, which is found in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, is a particularly apt and appropriate Parsha because, of course, it discusses demonstrations and dissatisfaction with the government. And that is a perpetual theme, of course, in human history. I don't think there has virtually ever been a democracy, certainly, that was entirely satisfied with their government. And different levels of dissatisfaction have taken hold at different times. And in our polarized age, Korach has some messages for us that I think are important, and feel free to hear them through whatever political lens appeals to you. In Pirkei Avot, which is Ethics of the Fathers, that is probably the best known of the rabbinic books. It's this epigrammatic book that has all sorts of comments that are familiar to us, like Hillel's, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" And in that book, it talks about a machloket, a dispute, l'shem shamayim, that is for the sake of heaven. And those machlokot, those arguments that are not for the sake of heaven. And the example that the book itself gives is a machloket l'shem shamayim is Hillel and Shammai. That when Hillel and Shammai disputed, however they disputed, ultimately, the purpose of the dispute was to elevate the heavens, if you will. In other words, to make the world better. That was the idea of the argument. It wasn't an argument, as Emerson once said, when Thoreau was leaving his house, he said, "Must we always argue for victory and never for truth?" In other words, sometimes the purpose of arguing is to win, and sometimes the purpose of arguing is to get to the truth. So for Hillel and Shammai, the purpose of the argument was to clarify the law and to elevate the souls of the people. What, says the Mishnah, is an example of a machloket that is not l'shem shamayim? Korach and his congregation. Now, let's start there. First of all, you notice Korach and his congregation are the people who rebel against Moses. It's Korach and his flunkies, his cronies, his his rallying people, the people who took him as the banner cry against Moses. But you'll notice the asymmetry in the Pirkei Avot in the way that it describes it, because it says Hillel and Shammai. This is a dispute from two sides that elevate the world, but the other is the dispute of Korach and his congregation, but it doesn't say against Moses. The way, if you wanted to write it the same way, you would say the dispute of Korach or Korach and his congregation against Moshe, but it doesn't do that. So the first thing that the commentators ask about this rabbinic phrase is, why does it say the dispute of Korach and his congregation? And there are two answers that I want to offer. There are many answers. There are two that I want to offer to you. The first is that the dispute broke out among Korach and his own congregation. That when you have people who are self-interested, they will fight among themselves. They won't only fight as a unified party against others. And so the group will degenerate into squabbling because ultimately it is driven by ego and not by purpose. So they can't march together because everybody wants to be at the front of the parade. The second part of this is Korach and his congregation weren't fighting against Moshe. That's why, even though ostensibly the rebellion was against Moshe and their arguments are against Moshe, what they're really fighting for is either against God, since after all, Moshe is God's designated leader, or they're fighting on behalf of their own egos, but not for anything. They're fighting because they want to be in front, but it's not animated by any greater purpose than the drive of their own egos. And if that is the case, then you can't really say that they're fighting for something. Now, when it goes on to talk about the dispute itself, it says in chapter 16, verse 3, it says, "You take too much on yourselves, seeing that the entire congregation are holy, every one of them." Now, why does it say are holy as opposed to is holy? Some people interpret this as the second major issue in the dispute between Korach and Moshe. And this one is a little bit, this goes deeper. That is, to designate a people as holy is a static condition. This is what they are. All of them are holy. And in fact, that is Korach's argument, is all the people are holy, so why do you get elevated status? But in fact, holiness is not only a legacy or a gift, it's also an achievement. So that's why you can have levels of holiness, right? Why does the high priest stand at the level of holiness that one of the lower priests does not? Because even though holiness might be an intrinsic gift by virtue of the fact that human beings are in the image of God and therefore holy, it is also true that holiness is something that both action and attitude can profoundly affect. And for Korach, the holiness was not something that he had to work at. Holiness was something that was given. So that is the second aspect of holiness. And then the third aspect of the, not of holiness, but of the dispute. The third aspect of the dispute that I want to point out to you is that there is between Korach's claim, where he says, Moshe asks, do you seek priesthood? And Korach responds, do you seek dominion? Do you want to rule over us? Notice the difference between the two. Moshe is asking, do you seek a life of service? Is what you want to be a priest? And Korach says, are you seeking a life of rulership? Is what you want dominion? And this is because the conception of leadership that exists between Moses and Korach is very different. There are different motivations why someone becomes a leader. But invariably, when someone runs for office, and you say to them, why are you running for office? They will almost never say, I'm going to say almost, you can substitute the exceptions to this rule. They will almost never say, because I am the smartest, best guy around, so of course I should run for office because I'm great. No, they'll phrase it as, there was something important that needed to be done, and I believed I could do it. And the difference between the two is the service of, not even the service, is the leadership of ego versus the leadership of service. And here, I think you see the real divide between Korach and Moshe, and it's one that is important to keep in mind as we evaluate leadership in general. Korach wants leadership because he has gnawing at him this deep envy of the fact that Moshe gets the accolades. Now, let me just say, parenthetically, the last person you want to envy is Moshe. I mean, yes, Moshe gets an intimate relationship with God. He has to see God panim el panim. There's a lot that is very wonderful about Moshe's life, but dear Lord, does he pay for it? Ooh, I mean, Moshe is tremendously afflicted by the day-to-day complaints, work, anger, necessity, responsibility of what he has to do. And that's why, because he's smart and envisions what will happen. Remember when God comes to Moshe at the burning bush and says, I want you to go to Pharaoh, Moses says, no, thank you. Pick someone else. I'm busy. I have a 2:00 at the salon. Okay, not exactly. But he says, I don't want to do this. I'm living in Midian. I'm pasturing sheep. I have a wife. I'm doing well. I'm out of the cauldron of Egypt. There are people who want to kill me. I don't speak right. Pick someone else. And the reason Moshe goes through that litany of why he doesn't want to be the leader is because Moshe doesn't want to be the leader. We learn in this parsha that he's Anav, that he's the humblest man on earth. And someone who is so humble doesn't envision themselves in the leadership position. And when they are forced to be in the leadership position, when Moshe is told by God, you have to do this, what you get as a result is somebody whose life is characterized by service and not by arrogance. I think, by the way, in American history, a paradigm of this, we've been blessed with several leaders like this, but maybe the paradigm of this is Lincoln. It's not that Lincoln didn't think he was very able. He thought he was very able. But there was in his bearing and in his conduct, especially to those who were close to him, even when they disagreed, a certain humility that lets you know that he acknowledged that he was a small player in a much greater universal drama. And so Moshe, the way you see this is when Moshe is told by God, I want to wipe this people out. I'm through with them. I'm angry at them. Moshe says, then eliminate me from the book you've written. Erase me. Because if you can't accept them and their foibles and their faults and so on, believe me, I as Moshe know I share the same faults. I'm under no illusions that my character is perfect. You can't imagine a Korach saying something like that. And the idea of the model of humble leadership, which is so rare in our time, is clearly the Torah's model. It's what the Torah wants and wants us to want. It doesn't want the leader who spikes the football. In fact, I use that analogy because I think it's true that in the last 30, 40, 50 years, humility has been devalued as a quality. In sports, when you win, you're supposed to lord it over your opponent. You're supposed to say how bad they are and how great you are. And in leadership, the Torah's model is very different. It is that you should acknowledge your own deficiencies because that enables you as a leader to be able to accept decisions that go against your inclination because you might be wrong. That's why when Miriam comes in and says that Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp, she says to Moses, there are other prophets. An ego leader would say, tell them to stop. I'm the prophet around here. But you remember Moshe's response? He says, I wish all the Lord's people were prophets. In other words, I don't want to be alone in this. I am, and I'll deal with it, but I don't want to be. I want everybody to be a prophet. Because if everyone were, the people would be in a better place, and I'm the leader of the people. That is my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. And the contrast of leadership here is so powerful because you see juxtaposed, it's not that Korach was uniquely evil. I don't think that there's anything that says that Korach is uniquely evil, and I will come back to that in a moment. But he's driven by the pedestrian concerns of his own ambition and his own ego need. And that can't be the model in the Torah for the leader who takes the Israelites across the desert. It can't be. The way that he mocks Moshe by repeating his words back to him, and the goals that he enunciates let you know that this is not about Korach elevating the people to a higher level. So, a strange, almost paradoxical thing about Korach, which you may not be aware of, is that some of the Psalms later on are called Psalms of Psalms of Korach or Psalms of the children of Korach. Because it's not as though there didn't exist inside of Korach and his children a religious impulse. There did. And Korach wasn't entirely an operator, or his rebellion wouldn't have meant anything, and presumably the children of Israel wouldn't have followed him. There was a bit of genuine religious feeling in Korach, and he composed psalms, and his children composed psalms that we still have in our liturgy in the book of Psalms. Some of the superscriptions are like for David, some are for the children of Korach. You can take a look through the book of Psalms and you'll see them. And that lets you know that a rebellion that has an element of truth can be more dangerous than a rebellion that is based entirely on lies. And that it is our responsibility as a society, when there is a rebellion that has an element of truth but goes in bad directions like Korach, to acknowledge and preserve and cherish the truth part of that rebellion, even if you don't give over to all the rest of it. I mean, so you can think of this in terms of movements that turn violent, even though the actual cause of the movement is a legitimate cause. So you reject the violence, but the kernel, the cause, the godliness within the movement, that is something that we accept. Remember, to use an example, remember when Ben Gurion fired on the Altanoia, on the ship that was carrying arms and members of the Jewish underground, because he knew that they were going to engage in acts of terror and to help upend the Jewish government. But their passion for the state of Israel was something that Ben Gurion cherished, and people associated with it eventually became part of the government of Israel and even prime minister. And the idea behind it was their passion is important and their goal is important, but there's an element of violence to this movement that will upend everything we're trying to do. And you could understand Moshe feeling, I get Korach. I know why there's a part of him that is genuine and real, but it is overlaid with so much other stuff, with so much ego and insufficiency, that a dispute that is not l'shem shamayim is Korach and his congregation. We're living in a time of extraordinarily rife dispute and polarization. And my fear, and I hear this all the time from each side, is that the other side is Korach. There is nothing in them that is worthwhile, that is worth listening to, that is worth giving credibility to, that is worth learning from. And I take it almost as axiomatic that is virtually never true. That there is almost no side of American mainstream politics, and I'm talking about that would draw a majority, on any issue, that doesn't have something to say that is worth hearing, even if in the end you disagree. And here, Moshe listens to Korach. He pays attention to him. It is only God who renders judgment. The judgment, of course, is pretty severe. The earth swallows Korach up. But you realize that even in the severity of the judgment, what it really is an acceleration of what happens anyway, right? From dust to dust. This is true of all of us. The earth swallows all of us up sooner or later. But here, it was a measure to preserve the integrity of the Jewish people as they walked through the desert, so that they could enter unified under one leader as they do under Joshua. So conduct yourself in the dispute like Moshe. Be willing to listen. Be willing to understand that the other side may have something valuable to say, even if you ultimately reject their conclusion. Even preserve their songs for the generations, as we did the Psalms of Korach. And through it all, stand with God and try to make your disputes the kind of disputes that are l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. Thank you. Hope to see you. Shabbat.